welcome everyone to this webinar, which is sponsored by Ryder Architecture. My name is Carl Brown. I'm the assistant editor of Building Magazine, and I'm here to briefly introduce this session today, which is called Net Zero, the Culture of Collaboration. It's a subject which couldn't really be any more topical, could it, as COP26 takes centre stage this week. We will be looking at how collaboration and sharing of knowledge can help us move towards a net zero future, and how the built environment industry can contribute towards that. I'm shortly going to be handing over to Ollie Jones, who is the research director at Ryder Architecture, who will be chairing the discussion. Do feel free throughout the discussion to ask the panel questions. All you have to do is pop the question in the box, the chat box, which should be on the right hand side of your screen. But that's enough from me. Ollie, over to you.
Cheers, Carl. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here talking to everybody about this fantastic topic around a culture of collaboration to reach and realize a net zero future. Now, we've got some fantastic guests on the panel today. Really looking forward to introducing them, and the discussion is going to be, as expected, probably quite broad ranging, with a wide number of topics in it. But I think, as we've seen, clearly seen the power of collaboration enacted to address shared global challenges in things like our COVID responses. We're now at a tipping point that we've seen coming for a long time around the climate emergency, as well as a number of other disruptive factors in the landscape of construction. So it's really important, it's really timely to have this conversation on where do we think some of the biggest wins can be around collaborating internationally. Where do we think we can identify some of the biggest challenges that we need to maybe overcome in order to benefit from international collaboration and accelerate our efforts to address those global challenges. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panel. Today we've got David Jarrett, who is Architectural Director at Ryder Architecture. We've got Helen Goodland, Principal Head of Research and Innovation at Sias Advisory. We've got Francis Halsband, Founding Partner of Clement Halsband Architects. We've got Maya Ferch, is Senior Program Manager in the Built Environment Program at the Louders Foundation. Currently standing in for James Drinkwater. Thank you, Maya. James is trapped at COP. And then we've got Josh Bullard, Director of Smart Energy and Sustainability at Hydrock. So I guess, let me kick the conversation off really by throwing some questions straight out to our panel. We'll try and draw in on some of your project experience as well along the way, but it'd be great maybe to start with Helen, and discussing where are we seeing the greatest opportunities for collaboration. I know that we've in the past talked about sharing knowledge around building safety and legislation, particularly around timber, because you're based in British Columbia. But where do you think those biggest opportunities for collaboration and impact are in our sector?
Well, thank you, Ollie, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So yes, from our vantage point out here on the west coast of Canada, we're very much being driven by shifts to a timber-based construction economy. I mean, Canada is one of the greatest timber producers in the world, so it doesn't really make much of a surprise. But this sudden enthusiasm, really, in the last 15 years or so, in new ways of using timber, has really forced some great collaborations right around the world. Some of those other timber economies, like you said. So we have a project right now, which I know you want to get to, which is around the Vienna House project. So Vancouver has teamed up through its city-to-city collaboration with its sister city, Vienna, and created an opportunity to actually share ideas on the ground. And I don't know if you want me to go into this right now, but
I think it's a great time for you to introduce it. I think it's
okay.
As I've said to you in the past, I think it's the living embodiment of collaboration, international collaboration in construction. I think it's an absolutely fantastic project.
Yeah. So the collaboration was really inspired by the political leaders of each of the two cities. So the Vancouver folks, the councillors, the mayor, went on a trip to Vienna, were just completely blown away with the innovation that was happening around social housing. Vancouver has a terrible housing crisis, and it was just such a great opportunity to see what was going on there. So the idea is that there will be a Vancouver house built in Vienna and a Vienna house built in Vancouver. And what that's doing is really allowing the project teams, the policymakers, the builders, even the trades, when we get to that, to really share what each other does. So for anyone who's interested in following the project, it has got a 1.4 million Canadian dollar research program attached to it. And it's just a everyday, 100 units of social housing. You can follow the Vancouver one, which is Vienna House. It's viennahouse.ca, and I'll put a link in the chat. But really what that's doing is it's allowing collaboration at all the different levels in the project value chain. And our job at SciAS is we manage this whole $1.4 million research program, looking for opportunities, whether it's researchers now being embedded with the structural engineering firm, or data management happening around sort of the social and economic models of housing. So it's full crazy, as you say, a sort of spectrum of opportunities. And the projects, like I say, it's about social housing. It's how do we make that better.
And I think it's a really good example of a really intelligent use of data to understand building performance, that sharing of data across different platforms to make informed decision making. And I know it's something we've been talking to you guys quite extensively about how do we bring some of the learning from the UK around value and developing intelligent briefs and value outcome statements over to BC to work on the Vienna House research stream with you guys. So it's an unbelievable opportunity as a project to engage in that wider conversation. I think I'll bring in Maya here because I know that there's a timber link. There's a bit of a theme developing here around timber, and we've definitely talked with the Louders Foundation in the past around, is there an opportunity to bring over some of that policy, some of that legislation, some of that building safety guidance on the use of mass timber, which is commonplace in British Columbia, over to the UK in order to benefit from it and accelerate us towards a net zero future. But Maya, it'd be great for you to tell us a bit more about the work going on at the Louders Foundation. And Maya joins us from Amsterdam, if I'm correct.
Yes, very correct. And thank you so much. So I think thank you for having us here. One point on Louders. So we're trying to tackle the dual crisis of both climate change and social inequalities. And we can talk about collaboration, but at the end of the day, we won't ever reach a systemic transformation that really tackles these two global crises without collaboration. And I think timber, to just go specific, is a super good example of how we can't scale timber in buildings if we don't really collaborate, or at least we can't scale the right use of timber in buildings if we don't really collaborate. As a policy level right now, timber is not on the same level playing field with concrete and steel. We need to change policy. Finance is still being hesitant because they don't basically at the end of the day have an incentive to build with timber. Industry is hesitant because they need to change the construction practices of today. And even building users don't exactly understand the benefits. And that's the beauty of collaboration, because we really need to make sure that these people come together and understand some of the research that Helen just pointed to say, what is it really that can enable the scale of net zero and sustainable solutions like timber or like circularity. And here, specifically in Louders, we're a private philanthropy, so we fund amazing organizations out there who help achieve the goals of Louders across climate change and social equity. And we do that while enabling collaboration, because I think if we dive into, we can all agree that collaboration is important. I think the challenge is how. And here we definitely see, like, I think there are two more overall challenges of why we don't collaborate more. Power imbalances, lack of incentive to do so, and lack of time. And here, as a private philanthropy, we really see we can help align some of those power balances, get the incentives more right at least, and fund organizations to have more time to really make sure that they collaborate. And just very last, before handing over, 2 specific initiatives that we're working on to enable this is the Built by Nature Timber Network and Built by Nature Network and Accelerator Fund that we just launched 2 weeks ago. That really is to help that systemic collaboration across change agents to scale timber. And we're currently working, hopefully we'll launch this in early in the new year, on also enabling that central collaboration infrastructure across Europe on circular economy solutions, as some of the same systemic challenges and barriers as we see for timber also plays for circularity.
And we'll come back to that point on circularity, because it's such an important one, and it's such a critical piece of the puzzle for net zero. I think you raise a really good point there, Maya, around the how of collaboration and what does that look like. You know, you rightly said we all agree it's important. We all know that it has to happen. I think project-based research and design-based research is a really powerful vehicle for collaboration, you know, as seen with the Vienna House project. I know that that Francis has got some experience with some really exciting projects in New York, which is where you join us from. Thank you, Francis. But around global public health, which is another key challenge, which is it's often not discussed when we're talking about net zero, but it would be very easy to make a net zero building that was incredibly poor for one's health, and actually I think there's another embodiment of a scheme over in New York with yourselves, Francis, that is all about addressing those big global challenges and bringing all of those different stakeholders to the table. So it's really interested to just hear a little bit more about that School of Global Public Health at NYU.
Sure, I think, and thank you for inviting me. I've already learned so much. I have to get everybody's email and start corresponding with them right away. What we discovered at the NYU School of Global Public Health is a couple of things. First of all, they know a lot more about gathering and using data than architects do. We will say something like, oh, I know daylight would be wonderful. They've got the numbers to show how daylight actually improves your health and improve daily life. So from the beginning, we were very excited to be working with a client that could use data for people. And that brings me to my second point. I think we all talk about healthy buildings. It's not really a very compelling argument once you get outside of this computer screen. People want to hear about healthy people. And so it's understanding how to design a building so that the users are happier and healthier seems like it's a better selling point, besides being maybe more realistic. When we worked on the NYU thing, we understood, for instance, there is all this data about energy use per square foot, but in fact the numbers should be energy use per person, because we should really be measuring how many square feet are being used by a person. If a person is in a tiny, inefficient space or in a large, very efficient space, well, how do you evaluate that? What we learned at NYU is that a high ceiling and a small footprint for an individual office was a better way to use the cubic square feet in the space. And this was before the pandemic. Little did we know, once the pandemic started, all of our research into how to make the perfect building wall and WUFI analysis about where the moisture was migrating and so on. The first thing that happened in the pandemic is everybody opened their windows. That was it. They sat there with their windows open. So what did we learn about that? I think we learned that one of the themes of my talk today is going to be, if you buy yourself a really good sweater, you can lower the thermostat by 5 degrees in every existing building and save the planet. Maybe I should stop right there, but I think that understanding people and users in the building, and maybe I should make one more pitch for understanding that instead of fighting your neighbors and trying to take down an existing building and discovering that everybody is ready to spend a year of your embodied energy as a consultant wasting your time because they don't want to let you take down that building, if you work with an existing building and find ways to adapt it to what you need now, you save a lot of time and have a lot more happier group of people when you're done.
And that's really a testament that takes us through to the value of retrofit for reaching a net zero future. And I think I agree with so many things that you've touched upon there, Francis, around trying to make the process as efficient but also as engaging as possible from the outset, in that you're bringing different communities together into one space. You're trying to develop an incredibly intelligent brief from the outset that addresses all of the challenges and needs of those different user groups and communities that might be involved in the building. You touched on a really interesting point there around data, and it's a thread I want to pull on a little bit. The need for architects to become much better at managing and handling and analyzing data and data sets, I think is incredibly important, and definitely chimes with what you've mentioned. I think it opens up a whole new conversation and a whole new realm of possibilities for architects to engage with other professional bodies, with health professionals, with transportation professionals, with all this huge diverse range of the wider sciences that might be able to enable us to create and deliver much more efficient and high value spaces in terms of the value that it can bring occupants. So I just handing over to Josh for a minute there around the value of data and the value of understanding and using data as a sector. And if we don't do this, somebody's probably going to sweep in from the outside and do it for us, and we and our buildings and our environments won't benefit from the potential level of insight that we could get. So Josh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. I think Maya was talking about this, the requirement to scale up drastically in terms of how we're delivering net zero. And, that's probably the sort of key challenge around supply chain. And for me, supply chain and data, they are intrinsically linked. They need to be linked. And this is a crucial way that we can help solve the challenge. So if we talk about sort of a traditional way of procurement, you've got assessment, you've got calculations, design, procurement. These are all undertaken in silo. What we need is to bring those all together. So if we take survey and retrofit, that process could take 6 months. We're dealing with the public sector decarbonisation scheme in the UK at the moment. That's a £2 billion fund. We're operating with lots of different clients, with councils, with university estates. It's a lengthy challenge that we need to be dealing with much quicker. So if we can simultaneously link up these data, link the outputs, think about the interoperability of these systems as well. So to give an example, if we take Qbot, which is a product that looks at underfloor heating, this is able to measure real-time surface temperatures, put that into a calculation process, output the demand for that system, look at the supply chain, put together a program, all in tandem simultaneously. That's going to be the key to how we can actually deliver this at scale. So I think someone else mentioned around bringing together all these other smart people. We've got lots of technical ability and lots of interesting novel ways of delivering systems, but at the moment we need to bring these together. That's a key thing. So that point there around predictive analysis being a sort of key component to help, I think, Francis, you touched on sort of socioeconomics. So taking energy data, we work with a company, Parity in the UK, who are able to monitor domestic portfolios across the UK, and they think we need probably 400,000 additional people potentially to be delivering to get to where we need for 2030. But we're missing a trick.
Oh, we've lost you there, Josh, for a second. So I guess we'll come back to you, Josh, because I think your mic was on and off for a moment there. On the data front, I think it's really important, and maybe we just do a quick round the group here. For that, there are international data sets out there, and if we're going to be sharing data between ourselves in order to address the same challenges, it makes sense that under the spirit of collaboration, that we also look at who's measuring what, where they're measuring it, and the data sets that you've talked about, Josh, would be equally as valuable, I'm guessing, to Francis in New York, as would Francis's energy and data sets around energy consumption and building operation in the UK or British Columbia or indeed Amsterdam. So just going quickly around the room, Francis has mentioned energy data, but has also interestingly thrown in there this occupant data, this focusing on people-centered data, which I think is quite interesting. Can I throw it back to you, and I'll shout you out as to what you think is a common data set that maybe we should be sharing internationally, and then we'll come to David following that, because I know David's got some particular views and insights around metrics and benchmarking across international regions. So maybe if we go to Helen first around those, what's that important data that we should be sharing in terms of data sets?
Goodness, I was really looking forward to hearing about Francis's perspective, so I wasn't quite ready. But no, I mean, for me, I think we have to talk about, well, what data you're talking about. Where we've been doing quite a bit of work, Ollie, is around sort of market capacity and understanding the market. I think that the construction industry broadly has done a woeful job of tracking at an industry level the issues and challenges that it faces. And certainly in North America, like, we don't know how well the building industry is doing at any particular point in time. The UK, I think, has been doing a much better job. So there's that sort of industry level data, how much waste is coming out of the industry, how many projects are delivered on time and on budget, what are the GHGs associated with construction activities. We've got some vague numbers, but they're really sketchy. And and then Francis's perspectives around the sort of the people dimension is like, oh my gosh, there's all of that as well. So I think there's that. For what we've been doing is trying to sort of leverage the growth and enthusiasm around mass timber and timber technology to point out how we don't have any benchmarks and we don't have any baselines. And if you are setting up a project right at the beginning, from our Vienna House experience, well, what are those metrics for success? And it's not best effort. That's so not good enough. So, I think we've certainly come to terms with the fact that we can't make valid decisions because we don't have any information about how we're currently doing from any of those vantage points. So back to you.
And this falls down to back exactly to Francis's point around how can the construction sector be expected to make real inroads to addressing its abysmal reputation for contributing to carbon emissions, amongst other things. And how can we make real inroads if we don't understand the data, if we can't get a handle on that data, and we can't form a coherent science-based argument to talk to these people around, to generate funding streams around, and to realize better value? So, like Francis just mentioned a few points, but where do you see that really valuable information being?
Actually, I like what Helen just said, because I think when we talk about construction, we talk about how much money, but no one ever says how about time, and the difference between a project that takes 6 months and a project that takes 2 years. What's happening? Where is that transaction, and how could we get hold of that? And my small example of fighting with a neighborhood for a year before you can start construction, that has huge implications for far beyond the painful experience of staying up in the middle of the night to appear at a community board meeting. So I think that's one thing. I do think that focusing on energy per person is a way of stopping this trend towards let's make everything bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think it's not going to help us to make things bigger and bigger and bigger. So understanding that maybe back to people, if you can persuade a person that an 80-foot square office in which they can reach everything that they need and they never need to stand up is a better thing than a 200 square foot office, you've just saved a lot of energy. So I keep coming back to people measures, which are actually the same: daylight for people, daylight for healthy buildings. You end up, in the same place, but you end up with a lot of people believing in what you're doing. So.
And I guess part of those people measures are the metrics that we should probably be collecting right now around social value and the social value that we're achieving, because that's part of this environmental discussion as well. That's maybe slightly aside from the net zero conversation, but it's definitely part of an approach to a holistic approach to environmental design. Maya.
Yes, thank you. This is one of my favorite topics, so thank you. I was worried if you wouldn't call me out. So I think Just before this webinar, I came out of another webinar as a participant listening to ECOS, EEB, and BPIE discussing embodied carbon. And they asked, I think, a really good question of when do we have enough data? When I think we all, especially we work a lot with the finance industry who keeps saying we can't act on whole life cycle carbon because we don't have data to set targets. And while I very much agree that we definitely need to improve both the quality and accessibility of data we have today, we really shouldn't let the lack of data or data quality paralyze action, because we simply don't have time for that. We worked with Ramboll for the past year, who's conducted baseline and benchmark and targets on embodied carbon, specifically in 5 countries across Europe. And one of the key learnings there is how little data we actually have on embodied carbon. We don't know anything. But when that is said, one, we definitely need to just start incentivizing more people doing LCAs. We talk about it all the time, so let's just get moving on it. But two, also we need to make sure that we don't need that much data to make sure that we take the right decisions. Like Francis says, in terms of looking at how many square meters do we really need, in terms of looking at different materials and how carbon intensive they are, it's not that difficult to understand that timber is less carbon intensive than steel. So I think while we work on the data challenge that we definitely and clearly have, we can really easily move and act and enable collaboration through that. I
think it's a really good time to go over to, Josh has just dropped out with an IT issue, but a really good time to go over to David. And I know, David, you've got some really sort of acute thoughts around the idea of benchmarking in different regions and metrics. So if maybe you could expand on those a bit for us.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. I think fundamentally I was always brought up as a budding engineer, as I was before I joined architecture, that you can't improve it if you can't measure it. And with the sort of evolution of the climate crisis, designers are fundamentally being held to more account. I mean, rightly or wrongly, you know, through the long gestation periods of buildings, but they're being held to account with some of the metrics that are going to happen at practical completion and through the operation of the building. So energy and embodied carbon targets, for instance. And we're talking about it much earlier. We're even seeing it earlier than when designers get involved, because it's actually driving feasibility plans where investors are looking for investment opportunities that are actually meeting these targets. So the fact that we're actually talking about these things throughout the whole life cycle is a massive win, rather than when you get to right at the end and we think, oh, we need to benchmark it and see how we're doing. We're actually starting to inform our process. And so that's where I really applaud the groups, the industry groups like Leti and RIBA, who are starting to put some of these metrics together, and not just metrics. They're talking about pathways and processes and how people can have these conversations with different people. They've just released relatively recently a client's guide to mapping out their carbon and addressing the climate emergency. So it's starting to elevate and start to understand and talk about engaging with supply chains, understanding that materials that we use in our buildings will change over time. So they don't just set targets for now, they set targets for 2030, because there's all this stuff going on in the background, and you never actually know when you're talking at day one about what targets you're going to achieve, that it's a moving beast. And I think that's probably one of the really hard conversations that you need to have with your clients is it's not an absolute number that's going to be a fixed point in time that'll happen 5 years down the track. So it's more that kind of process and conversation that I think is really important. an understanding, a common understanding around the metrics and what they actually mean and the definitions. So we're really putting that together for our designers within Ryder at the moment, to make sure that we're talking the same language. Now, before I left Australia, Green Star, the whole holistic green building rating tools, they were really endorsing people who are measuring embodied carbon within the design of their buildings. So they're developing all this information, but what are they doing with it? Now I hear that they're starting to look to LETI to start use their targets. But fundamentally, I don't think you can just take a target from the UK and set it up in Australia or set it up in the States, because where all the materials are coming from are all different. Facades predominantly in Australia are procured out of China. It's, you know, they're starting to replicate a lot of systems, where in the UK they come out of Europe. And the materials and the choices that they make are fundamentally different. But these conversations, by using these metrics, can start to inform and improve those processes that they're doing. So I think it's,
and that speaks to you know, to the place-based approach, really, of not just designing our projects, but also the way that we approach sustainability and how we approach net zero strategy in those spaces. I want to pull for a second there, David, on the idea and the conversation around supply chain. So interestingly, here at the Design for Planet Festival, the Design Council is running at the minute in Dundee in Scotland. One of the key things that's come out of that festival is a startling statistic that 80% of our emissions of the products that we create are embedded by the design process. The designers are responsible for 80% of the emissions that relate to that product, whether that product be a building or whether that product be the latest iPhone or laptop. It's those early stages. Now, we often talk about the actions and the collaborations that we can form, but I suppose there's a big elephant in the room here, which is, well, how the hell do we manage this supply chain? You know, what happens before all of this stuff gets to us, and how does that work? And I know that Josh has got some thoughts on this, but I think Francis and I have had a conversation in the past about a really interesting project that you guys ran in that really opened your eyes to those supply chain issues with the Uganda hospital. And it would maybe be great to hear a bit more about the real life experiences on a project before we dive into some of the nitty gritty around supply chain collaboration.
Sure. So it's a very tiny example and maybe too small to even be relevant, but let's give it a shot. We were asked to design a 10,000 square foot hospital, ambulatory care facility in Kibera, Uganda. It's a place with nothing. It's on the White Nile, but there's basically nothing there. When we started thinking about it, we thought, well, we're going to design a perfect white box in New York, and then they're going to helicopter it in and just drop it there. And then we started thinking, well, are people in Uganda really going to appreciate that kind of approach? We decided no. So we started looking at how we could build it out of local materials to make it, again, a friendlier place for people who are sick and already in a lot of pain. They would like to go to a place that they could recognize. What we discovered is that there is local brick. Everything in Uganda was made of a local brick, which was never fired to the right degree of heat, and so it would melt. And so everything was covered with stucco. You'd build out of these bricks and then cover them to waterproof them with stucco. So we came up with explaining to them that they needed higher temperatures in their brick kilns, and then they could make local bricks, which we could design, and they wouldn't need bricks and then stucco over it. So it was a simple thing. We also, there's no wood in Uganda. I'm sorry, Helen. There was not a stick of wood anywhere there. Couldn't use wood. Couldn't use big steel because the roads, such as they were made out of gravel. There was no way that a truck could reach this site. It just wasn't going to happen. So what we had to do was choose smaller pieces of steel that could be put together on the site. And halfway through doing this whole thing and talking to them about what was possible and training people to work with these local materials, I was sitting here and listening to the collapse of the supply chain. You know, everything in New York, I'm sure where you are too. While this is a tiny example, I thought, well, we have been forced, because there are no roads, because there's no technology there. We were forced to look at local skills, local technology, and the availability of local materials. And I just started to think, well, you know, would that work in upstate New York, where we do have wood, for instance? What about doing something there instead of sitting around in the coffee shop and complaining that we can't get cedar from the Northwest to finish our projects? So it just I don't know what the scale things are, but there's something there.
So I extending on from that, Frances, I think there's, you know, we've had some really acute experiences with the delivery of projects in remote Scottish Islands, you know, big community centre projects, but it is such that logistically it's incredibly difficult to remove things and also to take things to those locations. And it speaks to exactly the challenges that you faced on that Uganda hospital project, in that I think it absolutely forces us, and it's entirely relevant to the discussion around net zero, because it absolutely forces us to adopt a view of the site as a material bank. And I know that we've spoke about that in the past, and I can see Maya's ears pricking up there around that. There is an absolute element of circularity and the need for the construction sector and industry to support the development of that circular economy in that space. So we'll go to Maya just for a little bit on that, but then I know that Helen has also got some great experience with supply chains and timber supply chains within British Columbia that would also be good to jump to after, and then we'll dive back to Josh and David. So Maya.
Thank you. I think Frances, I love your example, because I think it shows how limitations sparks creativity. And I think that's what we've been needing for the past decades. The only limitation we've had in the built environment, besides of course technical requirements, has been finance and costs. And that has just been driving worse and worse building materials and worse building construction methods, etc. And now I think we have really an exciting opportunity to say, what is sustainability, climate, and social inequality are our limitations that we can utilize as architects, as engineers, as contractors, to spark that creativity that we need to change. Before joining Laudes, I headed up a strategy department in an architectural company in Copenhagen. And here we had to do a new development in an area of Copenhagen where there was nothing, which basically went against what we stood for, circular economy and sustainability. And then we started looking at what do we have around us, exactly the same process, but in Copenhagen rather than Uganda. And here we saw there was a metro in production. So we contacted the metro company, got the waste concrete from the production and establishment of the concrete to create new concrete. We got the timber beams that they used to transport big concrete elements on to do wall facading and floors. And then we contacted a social housing project very close that was just about to do a energy renovation, which meant they had a lot of windows that they didn't use anymore because the framing was rotten, not the glazing in itself. And as we know, carbon really sits in the glazing, not the framing. So we could take those windows, tear them apart, put them into new framings, make them double layered. So instead it was a 2 glazing, we made it a 4 glazing, and then they could perform to new energy standards. And I think that creativity of not asking whether something is possible, but how we make it possible can really challenge and change. And just getting back to the theme, we couldn't have done that without collaboration. I think that was, took even more time than developing the specific technicalities of these products, was to make sure that we found the right partners who had the same incentives to succeed with this. And that, frankly, took a lot of time, but it also enabled not just us to change and the developer who was paying for the building, but the whole value chain to really see what is possible if we dare to stretch what we think and can imagine.
Cool. Fantastic line there, Maya. I absolutely agree with you. It's not about us asking whether something is possible, but it's about making it possible. I think that's a really great sentiment, and something we should be acting on. Helen, as for understanding supply chain, so one of the big challenges for us is, again, we've talked about data, we've talked about not really knowing where our opportunities for sourcing materials or sourcing sustainable materials are, and there's a whole piece in there around how do we understand the ecosystems in which we collaborate, but much more intricately.
Yeah, it is. I actually really enjoyed Maya's comment, yes, as well. I thought that was very, very profound. So we found that as the construction industry is starting to wake up to the value of innovation, and that they do need to do a lot more with a lot less, whether it's materials or workers or whatever it is. The industry has not done a good job over the years of laying the groundwork of, well, where, have they mapped who's doing what in the industry? What is their technology ecosystem that's on their doorstep? What's going on in research centers and labs around their community? Which research teams are available to support them if they've got a good idea that they want to develop? And what we found, particularly in our part of the world, well, Canada broadly, was the research community was not talking to the construction community. The research community was not even set up to be able to engage with construction on a project by project basis. I mean, Ollie, your job, my job, has spawned out of the need for the industry to do a much better engagement process and to understand what's going on. And what we've also found is that it's very difficult to get financial support to develop those ecosystems. Like a good chunk of the work we do, which is mapping construction technology in Canada, or the mass timber, developing mass timber economy, we have to go groveling to local governments to try and find little bits of money here and there, because again, the construction industry, despite its size, doesn't have that investment infrastructure to develop for itself. I look at what the farming community is doing in Canada right now. They've got like $1.5 billion worth of growth funds there to basically transform food production and build food resiliency and food security. The construction industry is doing none of that stuff because it doesn't see itself in that role. It's very dispersed. It's primarily small businesses. They don't have the same sort of voice, and there's not the same motivation for change writ large, because most of them thrive on inefficiency, right? The average construction company makes its money on the rework and on the change orders and on the so the value that it has to put back into the projects to make them complete. So it's sort of a broken baseline that we have to fix. But for me, we've been really having to catch up a lot, and that's a lot of the work that SciAS has been doing, is mapping who's who in the zoo, construction technology, digital support, research, the whole area. So yeah, needs to be done, and we don't have the financial supports to do it all the time. Unfortunately, it's a bit piecemeal still.
And I totally agree with you, Helen. Just diving quickly to Josh. Josh, we've spoken in the past, and you mentioned that your views around the parity of data and a data-led approach is absolutely critical to how we engage with supply chains, but also to how we realize things that are a bit more specific, like retrofit projects and programs of work. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, and apologies, I cut out before, so I'm not sure how much you caught of when I was speaking before, but yeah, for me, it's linking together all of these various aspects, and certainly for us, it's around what we can do to scale up that transition. So we have a real challenge at the moment around just the supply chain and the amount of knowledge that's available to deliver these projects at the pace and the change that's required. I think part of the constraint that we've had certainly in the past, if we look at the contractor-led sort of approach, it's primarily been compliance-led up until certainly recently. I think that the sea change for us, certainly over the last 18 months, what we're seeing in the market is being driven through ESG ultimately, in terms of environmental social governance strategy, where we've got essentially the risk of sort of stranding assets. So this is a big one for us now, is around how do we pull together all those various parts of the supply chain, undertake the benchmarking, work together with groups, lobbying groups, whether that's such as London Energy Transformation Initiative, where we can build this empirical set of data to help then explore what's the best approach depending on the archetype that we're exploring. So I'm primarily on the sort of real estate side there. But that's very much our approach.
And I guess just turning this a little bit as we go to David, we're talking about a culture of collaboration here, and we've mentioned data an awful lot, and I feel like data is something that is an enabler and that will get us over the line. But what if we go around the house again? What do we feel are the most important things to developing that culture of collaboration within our industry, not necessarily within our own businesses, but within our industry and across our sector, and indeed out into other sectors to enable us to realize net zero quicker? So David, maybe over to you for that one.
Yeah, I think just thinking about that whole circularity of materials, it's one of the big topics of evolution down here in London, with the Greater London Plan having a big focus on it with your planning, for instance. And just getting people to think about that process. But then even just thinking about within the building and what's on your building site alone is kind of limited. So actually thinking about with your materials, like you've been looking and talking to these concrete technicians, if you will, that are looking at other waste streams outside of the building that start to adapt and plug in plastic to make it more durable, cure faster, and essentially start to think outside our building box is going to be huge, and starting to look at that sort of data and understanding waste streams to start to utilize those sort of things. So that'd probably be my first.
Cool. Let's go around the house. Let's go to Francis. What are those really important aspects to developing that culture within the industry?
Actually, I have sort of two things. I have to ask Josh a question. I'm overwhelmed by something he said before. However, so I've got a relatively small office in New York. There are 25 of us. So the only way that I can function at all is by connecting with an engineer who has a 100-person office, or with a research group at the School of Public Health and so on. So the key to my being able to function at all is associating with other professionals and other non-professionals. So I think that it's just it's obvious. Can't sit in my office. Nothing happens if I just sit in my office. However, the other thing I really want to say is because I have a small office perspective, I keep looking at things that we in our office can accomplish that will make things better. We're not going to do that great research project on every stick of wood traveling around Vancouver. It's not going to be us. We can learn from it. But Josh said before something about an underfloor heating system. And I want to come back to that for a minute, because it seems to me that one way of looking at the two big problems that we can, each of us, solve every day. One problem is that all of our lighting is up on the ceiling, and we're spending too much money on getting the light from way up there down to where we work. And the other problem is that we're heating entire spaces, although we only occupy the lower third. And when Josh said underfloor heating system, I just kind of leapt out of my seat, because if we could design systems that just heated the part of the space where people were, I think that could have enormous impact on existing buildings and new buildings. So I will not leave this webinar until I hear more about that.
Josh, quickly over to you before we carry on the culture.
We could probably touch on sort of heat transfer as a whole session, really, but no, I think choice of appropriate systems is absolutely crucial in terms of how we're going to deliver net zero. And one of our probably biggest challenges that we have, certainly on projects we're looking at in the UK, is around antiquated higher temperature systems, how we can transfer those to lower temperature, low carbon systems. So a lot of the work we're doing at the moment is on that very piece of understanding, okay, well, what are the key components? What are the energy factors here? Firstly, can we retrofit? Is there the ability to connect these various components? Then secondly, what's the behavioral impact to this? As we move towards sort of a decarbonised grid in terms of power, actually the biggest focus then becomes our sort of upstream and downstream emissions and behavioural impacts. So a study we looked at recently for a large build-to-rent scheme, I think the impact of behavioural sort of approach in the building could be a doubling or a tripling in terms of the energy use intensity. So that one particular product I mentioned, the Qbot, I think is really interesting from what I was talking about from I suppose a procurement side in terms of that supply chain. How can we scale up and more readily deploy initiatives that aren't a sort of traditional way of looking at it? So that siloing of procurement, of energy management, of design, doing all of that at the same time and using those outputs to inform other decisions. So whether that's well-being indicators, sharing of that data, we've got the data. I think others mentioned this already. The data exists, but there are issues around it being available, being open source and publicly shared. So again, if you take some of the energy suppliers in the UK, the likes of Octopus, they've got access to half-hourly data, which is incredibly valuable and is showing us what is actually happening on the ground in terms of domestic portfolios and also the change through hybrid working, future work habits, this move towards a different way of, we have a real issue in the engineering world around what is the right demand profile for a building. It's all speculative, and we have empirical sets of data that serve no bearing on what is actually happening in practice. So we have to explore sensitivity across that and look at boundaries of, well, where do we think we're going to be and what's the likely impact of not approaching it from a. So I think, we probably started on a particular technology. I've sort of come full circle, but for me it's, there's quite a few factors there at play, but data sharing and that element is absolutely crucial.
Wonderful, thanks for your response there, Josh. Helen, how about those things that are critical to developing that culture of collaboration?
Yeah, well, I think it's about communicating that data in ways that are powerful and compelling to those who need to take action. And I think we've done a pretty poor job of that. So for us, we're starting with this drive to try to transform the industry out here into more efficient practices using low carbon prefabricated timber materials, which are highly precise. And, we need to change those practices. But to get that started, we needed to then point out what waste was coming out of traditional building practices that would compel builders to look at prefab. So the Vienna House project allowed us to explore, the amount of material that comes out on a per square meter basis. So looking at LEED certified projects across Canada, where we have division data, we found that, they had an average division rate of 85%, but that was still accounting for 100 kilograms of material excess to requirements that were being bought and brought to the construction site and then taken straight to the landfill. 100 kilograms per square meter. So that's insane. A client is buying materials, it's coming to the site, and it's not even going in the building, it's going straight to the landfill. The average division rate for a building in Canada is not 85%, it's 16%. So you can imagine, take that, scale it, that's like 5 or 6 times. That's almost half a ton of materials bought and paid for, travel to the site, not going in the building. Now can we deal with waste? And now can we see value in prefabrication?
Absolutely. Maya?
And before I answer your question, just building on what you're saying, Helen, I think that's such important facts that we have to get much clearer. So thank you so much for raising it. And I think we also see more and more people working on construction sites leaving the industry because they're not motivated to take new materials and throw them out. It's crazy, and it scares away talent from the industry. So it's not just the climate, it's also the people-centric approach to this. But if I should answer your question, Ollie, I think McKinsey several years ago launched this study on which industries are the most innovative, and built environment came last. Only farming was less innovative than the built environment. And honestly, I actually think that might have changed since, because farming is really being increasingly innovative, and we're not seeing the same speed of the trend in the built environment. And I think the reason for that is because we don't have a culture of R&D. We haven't necessarily seen the need for innovation. And I think if we start understanding the climate urgencies and the people need to improve our buildings, we will need to start innovating. And I really do hope and believe that that will also change the culture of the industry, because it will also attract other people that will want to change and see the also business benefits to change. And I think here, from a Loudis perspective, we're setting up Build by Nature as a Timber Accelerator Fund to try to help that infrastructure for collaboration, because I think we all want it. It's just about how we do it.
I think building on that point, Maya, yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's some amazing innovation going on at the minute, but it's out of pure necessity. And actually, some of the biggest disruptors that we're working with in the advanced materials space, then they're not from the construction sector. They're chemists and biologists, and part of this is the idea around international collaboration. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel. You know, if I need to understand how potentially an innovation around an algae-based bioreactor for a building that might clean the air and produce high-value biomass works, I go to Australia because that's where the best marine biologists in the world are. You know, if I want to understand timber, I go to Sweden or go to British Columbia. You know, there are locations with such a wealth of knowledge and expertise, but in terms of our siloed nature and our inward-looking nature within the construction sector, we really need to start reaching out to those wider arts and sciences. And I think, you know, part of picking up of what you just said is that I honestly don't think there's been a more exciting time to be in the construction sector. You know, I think it's absolutely electric at the minute, and this is the greatest opportunity for design and construction to show its value to the world in how we achieve and help countries to achieve net zero. But it requires some absolutely fundamental change from us as professionals in the way that we collaborate, in the way that we engage with external parties, and the way that we take ownership of the problem. You know, for too long in our sector, I think we've pushed the problem to another area of the sector, and actually we need to move away from that compliance-led, cost-focused, short-termist view and take ownership of what's happening in this entire process, what's happening in the supply chain, ask some critical questions, make those challenges in order to be able to really deliver on our responsibility, not just to the sector, but to the planet in what we're trying to achieve. So that I think there's some critical, fundamental structural changes that need to happen within construction, within the way that we engage with one another, and the way that we use knowledge and information and share that knowledge in order to realize a better future and a more sustainable future. Very quickly, we're running down in the last 3 minutes of this. I want to go back through and hear just a sentence from each of you guys around the importance of collaboration in our sector. A final word on collaboration from you all. So if we could just go to Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. For me, I think it's alignment of values, isn't it? You know, alignment of social value as an outcome. So, you know, don't get left behind. We have to do this. There's the urgency factor that needs to occur to really deliver at the scale that we need. So that requires that we collaborate, that we knowledge share, because, you know, this is a fast moving area. So that's the big one for me.
And Helen?
Yeah, I mean, for me, construction is just such an unbelievably complicated undertaking that it's unreasonable to expect that you have all of the experience at your fingertips and that you are an expert. I think humility goes with collaboration, and, you know, knowing that, as you say, there are centers of expertise around the world, and to develop them. That, you know, I really enjoy the fact that BC is a growing timber expert, but we look to Vienna for social and economic and innovative housing models that are socially just. So, you know, that I think is the key, is to know that there are different places in the world that develop different things.
Mm-hmm. Frances?
I guess I would say diversity. The point of collaboration is to hear a point of view that's not your own and see what you can learn from it. You hardly ever learn anything from yourself.
Fantastic point. David?
I just think the advent of more virtual conferences, I mean, just looking at the people like on screens at the moment, half of them are from outside of the UK. So just getting that different perspective into these forums is something that's happening more and more often. And I think that will start to fuel a lot more conversations. And just by bringing people together virtually is enabling a lot of that conversation to happen a bit more readily. And it's amazing to see. I think it's fantastic.
Excellent. And Maya?
And maybe I'll just add people. I think at the end of the day, we're all people and we all use buildings. And we have to remember that when we talk about all the technical challenges of change.
Mm-hmm. And I guess you know, we couldn't end on a better set of points from everybody. We've reached the end of our time here today, but picking up on something David said, I think that it's absolutely critical and fundamental to utilize our modern technologies to be able to convene such exciting groups of people and thinkers into one space, and it's something that we're pushing very hard to do all of the time. And we have a Future X podcast series that pulls these great thinkers into one space. So if you want to follow us and subscribe and continue the conversation, I think that's the key point. We talked a lot about data being absolutely key and sharing data, but the human aspects and the behavioral traits and the human cultural traits between people and sharing ideas and values being very important as well. And then a fundamental cog in the background of all of this that's definitely come through this chat today is circularity, and the focus on circularity being one of the key drivers for us to focus our collaborative efforts on delivering throughout the whole life cycle of a building and the construction process. So I just want to say a massive thank you to all of the members of our panel. I've really enjoyed the chat. We could probably go on for another hour. It's flown by, but thanks so much for being on the panel, and thanks to all of our audience for joining us today to hear from you guys. Cheers.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks for convening.
Thank you.